Welcome to our weekly 3 Minute Therapy podcast with me. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, clinical psychologist at 3minutetherapy.com. And I have as my trusty co-host, as usual, Mick Berry, who's always very passionate. I admire your passion, Mick.
Thanks.
And we discuss rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, which was devised by the renowned psychologist Albert Ellis, whom many of you, I'm sure, have heard of, in the 1950s. And his main premise, he had a few of them actually, was our emotions don't come from situations, but our emotions and our behaviors come from our thinking, views, perspectives, opinions about situations. And when people disturb themselves and make themselves anxious, depressed, angry, guilty, and act self-defeatingly, such as acting addictively or procrastinating, then that comes from demands, musts, shoulds. I must do well and get approval. Others must treat me well, and my life must be fair, easy, and hassle-free. So that's the structure of these ideas. Albert Ellis has written over 80 books, so you can read more about that. And today we're going to have a wild and woolly discussion of Carl Jung. So, Mick, since you are so passionate, do you want to start with your view of Carl Jung?
Well, first, you mentioned the ways in which people can disturb themselves. You said procrastination, and what else?
Anxiety, depression, anger.
You didn't thank you. You didn't mention anxiety and depression because I find those to be much more severely self-defeating than simply procrastination. So I wanted to make sure that we mentioned anxiety and depression and rage.
Right, right, exactly.
Okay.
And although procrastination is very, very common, and it's so common that therapists just think it's part of life and often don't address that with their clients. So procrastination is also very important.
And yeah, and I would say depending on what the thing is, what the activity is, person's procrastinating on, it could be mild or it could be severe. If you're procrastinating on, well, this is extreme, getting out of a burning building, that could be severe to not get out of the burning building. Or if you're procrastinating on applying for a job or doing something at work which is crucial to keeping your job, then it could be have devastating effects if you don't do it.
Right. Okay, we were going to discuss REBT and Carl Jung. And Mick, would you like to start in on Carl Jung? Not a favorite of yours.
Well, I think this is actually a good topic for me to address simply because I remember people asking Albert Ellis, since we're all fallible human beings and nobody's ever perfectly rational, are you, how do you tend to be irrational? And I remember he said, well, I lead these Friday night workshops and sometimes people are talking while I'm talking. I ask them not to talk and they say we weren't talking, and then I resume and then they continue talking. And I say, please don't talk while I'm talking. And they'll say we're not talking. I'll say, you're talking now. Stop talking, please. And then they continue. And I say, this is Albert Ellis talking, I say to myself, how can they do this? And the answer is easily. And so I tend to disturb myself on other people shouldn't have such idiotic ideas. And I see Freud and Jung as two people that had incredibly idiotic ideas and hoodwinked the world into creating careers for themselves at the expense of other people's well-being. And I tend to get infuriated over that. So this is a good topic for me to talk about because it gives me a challenge to not upset myself and also to see if, hey, possibly I have something that's valuable. But when it comes to Jung or Freud or other schools of thought, what I often see people doing is investigating other schools of thought rather than, as Albert Ellis would put it, getting off their ass and doing the exercises to make themselves feel better. So I see Jung as a diversion that is really not self-helping and possibly quite self-defeating.
Okay. So you didn't say much about Jung, so I'll say a few things about Jung. And as we discussed before we got on the recording, we have different views of Jung, and Jung had some very nutty, out to lunch ideas about the collective unconscious. And by the way, Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, I
Yeah,
think around the late 1800s.
um,
And
he followed.
he and Freud were friends for a while, then they parted ways. Mick?
No, I was just saying he followed Freud. I think he was Freud preceded him a little bit.
Yeah, right. Okay, so one of the useful things for me about Carl Jung, and everyone, no matter how imperfect, sometimes maybe by accident says useful things. And he came up with the idea of personality types, introverted personality and extroverted personality. There are various personality typologies like the Myers-Briggs, which is quite popular but has no validity or reliability. But you can notice, and I've noticed this in myself, for example, in terms of a general personality style. So there's the introverted personality, which tends to be reflective, reserved, prefers to be alone or in small groups, and the extroverted personality style that tends to be outgoing and gregarious and prefers large groups. And most people are a combination, actually. And I'll say more about how to address that in yourself if you notice one of those personality styles. Yes, Mick?
I was going to say Freud was born in 1856, died in, I believe, 1941. Jung was born in 1875, died in 1961. So Jung did follow Freud.
Yeah.
He came after Freud. But I did want to say, in mentioning those things, I think you're a lot kinder to Jung than I care to be, because even if you dig up Freud, you can come up with something that was useful. But I dismiss these
Right.
people as really not being worth someone's time to look into. People would do better, in my opinion, to get at what it is that's eating at them, get their own demands, and to help themselves feel better. And somebody could accuse me of being an REBT purist, but I simply think I care about truth and what is going to be effective. Now, that being said, it's important for me to remember that anybody is free to investigate whatever they want, and people can lead themselves astray, and it happens all the time, every day. And I indeed can do the same
Yeah.
thing. One of the ways I can lead myself astray is to insist that people not think Jung had much to offer. I don't think he had much to offer, but many people swear by him.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think Jungian therapy is very popular these days. Many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, I actually knew a therapist who considered herself a Jungian, but I haven't heard of that uh, from people at all these days, and also hardly at all uh, people who consider themselves psychoanalytic or Freudian. Mick?
Yeah, I do encounter people that you have Jungian therapy and use a therapist with a Jungian approach to delve into their dream interpretation and the collective unconscious and the synchronicity. And then I'll also say that Jordan Peterson continually cites Jung as a heavy hitter in the field of psychology, and people buy into this. I see this all the time on YouTube. He's constantly quoting Jung or referring to Jung. So I do see people maybe not as having a Jung approach in personal therapy sessions, but I do see people touting Jung as being a brilliant mind, whereas I think he's pretty trivial at
Yeah,
best.
right. Now, if you tend to be more introverted, which means you prefer to be alone or in small groups, you tend to be reserved and reflective, and you want to change that and be more outgoing, you can look at some of the demands that we discussed earlier that you have a must or a should or a dire necessity, such as I need approval, so I uh, will not take risks with people, say what I feel because I might be disapproved of. Um, or extroverts tend to have a demand, I absolutely must be with people. So when they're alone, they feel kind of empty. Also, extroverts sometimes have a must. I must have social stimulation, and I can't stand it when I don't, and upset themselves that way. Mick?
Yeah, and I think this idea of introverts and extroverts is possibly antithetical to REBT because Albert Ellis advocates thinking of people not in terms of one thing or another. Now, you did say if you tend towards introversion or extroversion, but it's still a label people are placing on themselves, which could be useful in terms of identifying particular behavior. But I think it's incorrect to say that somebody is entirely introverted or label somebody an introvert or an extrovert. These are still tendencies, and it's a matter of what is it that we would like to achieve and what is it that we would like to do. And if I have a tendency towards introversion, it could be useful to identify that and then see, well, how can I be more extroverted or vice versa?
Yeah, I have a tendency toward introversion, and I think you, Mick, have a tendency toward extroversion. Would you agree?
No. And I can explain why.
Yeah,
Because I can be quite introverted and like it, and have a tendency towards introversion. And actually, this is something I perform a lot. I'm a drummer and a musician, actor, stand-up comic, and a lot of people don't realize that actors and people that perform are actually quite shy
yeah,
and towards introversion, and the performing is often connected to a demand for approval. And that's why people do it. And as we know, that's not good to demand approval from others and rate yourself by others approving of you. But I know so many performers that do that. And so it may appear that actors or performers are extroverted and putting themselves out in public when actually they have a tendency towards introversion, and the performing is a reaction to their tendency to be introverted, so they push themselves to be extroverted in their behavior.
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting insight. Well, I had nothing else to say about Carl Jung. How about you, Mick? Did you want to
Well,
add some more?
yeah, I have a lot to say, but I want to say it without making any demands upon it. I think that one of the reasons you're not bothered nearly as much as me about charlatans spouting out all sorts of stupid ideas is because you've seen a great deal of it and you've come to terms with the field of psychology having many idiotic ideas which people follow, whereas I'm appalled by it because I think if somebody's getting paid to do something and they're training to learn how to do something that they think is going to help people, it is definitely counterproductive to find or pursue some avenue that isn't going to help and that is even going to hurt people. So, as I mentioned, this is something for me to continue to work on, to accept that the world has fallible human beings in it, and sometimes they can do a great deal of damage. And regarding Jung, I think principally of him with the collective unconscious and synchronicity and that angle, which I find I find myself it's quite challenging to accept that because I see people all of the time misleading themselves principally, and we have discussed this, you and I have discussed this, one of the biggest fallible thoughts people have is that their experiences determine how they feel. People generally, I think, are not aware that how we think determines how we feel, and that specifically, if we make demands, we'll disturb ourselves, whereas if we have acceptance, we will not disturb ourselves, and that this is a lifelong pursuit to cultivate acceptance and downplay demands.
Yeah, and I would just extend that to unconditional acceptance of oneself, unconditional acceptance of others as the imperfect humans they are, and unconditional acceptance of life with all its problems and difficulties.
And I would do a lot better to be more accepting of the fallibility of other people. It's quite hard for me to accept it when I see great damage being done by other people's thinking and ideas, which they teach to other people, and then the behavior that ensues from that. I find it very hard to accept that. And I'll say it's important to attempt to counter that and to teach people truth and for us to discover truth ourselves. Hey, there might be something I could learn that's valuable by Carl Jung, and I'm possibly closing myself off to that. So I'll throw that out there, but I haven't really seen it.
Yeah, since we've been discussing acceptance a lot, and you said you find it hard to accept certain things, especially in people. I just wanted to mention that sometimes people misunderstand what REBT says about acceptance. By acceptance, we don't mean liking something. If someone's obnoxious, acceptance doesn't mean you like them. It just means you recognize that they have a right to be obnoxious. That's reality is reality, not the way you think it should be. And but you don't have to, but you don't like it, and you could try to encourage people if you know them personally or have contacts with them to try to be more reasonable. But disturbing yourself about it doesn't help. Mick?
And I was going to say also, acceptance doesn't mean resigning ourselves to a particular undesirable outcome. If it's possible for us to do anything to avoid that outcome that we don't want, then it's best, as Albert Ellis would say, to get off our ass and accept that this situation is difficult, not what we want, but what can we do to change it while accepting that maybe it won't change, but I can try to get it to change and never have to stop trying to get it to change. But unfortunately, or in terms of what I want, unfortunately, it isn't the way I'd like it to be right now. But by accepting it, I'll be better prepared to do what I can to see if I can change it.
Yes, another thing that Ellis has said, which helps me accept the crazy or ignorant behavior and words of other people, is he said, humans tend to be arrant screwballs of the worst sort. So if you realize that, then you're not going to be shocked or disturb yourself about people acting like screwballs.
And again, not to resign ourselves to that because we are human beings and we ourselves can be errant screwballs of the worst sort. So what can we do? Well, first thing is accept ourselves this way. And when we find ourselves being screwballs, don't compound it by saying, I must not be a screwball. Gosh, there I go being a screwball. Okay, how can I not be a screwball? Where's the demand? Get rid of the demand. I did want to say, people that are watching this podcast, I think they'll notice that we're not really saying anything new each episode of the podcast. It's all about find your demand, get rid of it, keep your desire, and live as rationally as you can. The message, I don't believe, will ever change. It's just something that continually needs attention.
Yeah, and we apply it. That's a good point, Mick. We apply the same message to a whole variety of situations, but it is the same message. Look for your musts and shoulds and your awfulizing and question, challenge, and contradict it. Yep.
And this is, I think, my main objection to Freud and Jung and other schools of thought. Often people get diverted by other schools of thought when really the thing that is at the expense of doing the work to get rid of their demands.
Yeah, right.
Once
It
you're rid of
takes work. It takes work and practice and more practice.
yeah,
Yeah,
once you diminish your demands and get rid of them, explore whatever you want to do. But the first thing is be as rational as you yourself can. And if you're avoiding doing that by investigating Jung or Freud or whoever it is, then it'd be best to go back to REBT and get rid of your demands.
yeah, yeah. Okay, very good. I think we covered a lot of ground there. And I'd like to thank Chris Rossini, our tech engineer. Thank you, Mick, once again for your great insights. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, author of the book 3-Minute Therapy. Uh, Please comment below if you liked it or found something here valuable. Give us a thumbs up. Suggest subjects for future podcasts. Volunteer if you'd like to volunteer. We haven't had a volunteer for a while, but we've had many over the years. So volunteer and we could discuss your questions, help you with a problem. If you're a therapist, give you some supervisory suggestions on working with some of your most difficult clients. And subscribe to the 3-Minute Therapy podcast to do what, Mick?
Well, to stay on the rational side of life as long as you can, and then as a fallible human being, when you find yourself slipping away from the rational side of life and being irrational, do what you can to get back to being rational and realize that this is a lifelong pursuit. You want to stay on the rational side of life as long as you can. You slip off, and then the times in which you are irrational can become less and less, and the times which you are rational can become more and more and longer, so that you're mostly rational all of the time.